find a virtuous woman, for her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant's ships. She bringeth her food from afar. She riseth also while it is yet night, and giveth meat to her household, and a portion to her maidens. She considereth a field, and buyeth it. With the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. She girdeth her loins with strength, and strengtheneth her arms. She perceiveth that her merchandise is good. Her candle goeth not out by night. She layeth her hands to the spindle, and her hands hold a distaff. She stretcheth out her hand to the poor, yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of the snow for her household, for all her household are clothed with scarlet. She maketh herself coverings of tapestry. Her clothing is silk and purple. Her husband is known in the gates, when he sitteth among the elders of the land. She maketh fine linen, and selleth it, and delivereth girdles unto the merchant. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise up, and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. This is the word of the Lord. Praise the Lord.
All right, we are in our series on marriage. To the chagrin of some, we're still talking about it, and will be for a good while, actually. But today we're talking about responsibilities, and perhaps some of you are sitting there and you're thinking about that title, and you're looking at that text, and you're wondering how I'm going to work in the man's responsibilities. I'm not. Men don't have responsibilities. Ha ha. Just joking. No, we're going to talk about men next week, okay? So to this week, only going to be talking to the ladies. We're only going to focus on the wife's role. Now, too often in marriage, we're like Peter and John, right? We're like Peter, actually, more than John. We're like Peter looking over our shoulder, wondering what's their job. And that's the very wrong way to approach marriage. So today we're going to be talking about the wife's responsibilities in marriage, and you shouldn't be thinking about them saying, but how does that speak to my husband? You should be thinking, how does that speak to me, you ladies? So don't do that. And for all you men that are out there grinning, all happy that I'm not going to be speaking to you, you should be praying that I'll be very balanced and measured, because if not, I'll feel like I have to equalize the situation next week. So let's just hope that we can be, just very balanced and measured today. All right, let's talk a little bit about the text of this poem, Proverbs. In many ways, this is a very typical poem for its time and culture. Like, for instance, if you don't know, this is an alliterated poem. You don't see it in the English translation because poetry doesn't translate awfully well from one language to another. But in the Hebrew version, the original version of this, every line of that poem starts with a different successive Hebrew letter, much like the way Psalms 119 is divided up into the Hebrew alphabet. This psalm, this poem of the woman is written the same way. So that was actually pretty typical of that. It's not uncommon to find poems in that way. It's also very thematic in the way it's structured. We won't get into this. I just want to point out a few things, and it's charismatic in that it has a center, or what they call a Janus. It has a center of the poem, and it sort of reflects outward from that center both ways. So if you look at it, you'll see that verse 19, if you're looking, is like the hinge, or it's like the seam, they call it, of this poem, and both sides of verse 19 are reflecting the other. And so it has very typical formatting to that. However, it's also very atypical. So it's typical in some ways, and it's very atypical in other ways. In the most meaningful of ways, it's nothing like any other poem, pretty much, that we would find in the culture. Now, it's typical of the scriptures in this way, right? Because the scriptures are very atypical. Right? And that's one thing. When people say that the Bible is just another book, these are people who have not read it or have not paid close attention. Because even if you conclude after reading it that you don't believe it, the Bible's not typical. It is a very, very atypical book, a very odd book. It defies our expectations all the time. All the time. This is one of them. This is a very good example of how the scriptures defy and contravene all cultural expectations. So here we have this book, and I'll give credit to Bruce Waltke. If you're looking for a really good, in-depth commentary on Proverbs, Bruce Waltke perhaps wrote the best one. It's a 2-volume set. You can get it on the Kindle, reasonably inexpensive if you're interested in a really good commentary on Proverbs. But anyways, Bruce Waltke observes that this is a typical, what we would call a heroic poem, right? You have a hero, and it's praising this heroic figure, right? And it's this woman, and so it's praising that. And in that sense, there's a certain typicalness about it, but the poem specifically rejects all the typical tropes you would expect, especially at the cultural context in which it was given. So if you think somebody's going to write a poem about women thousands of years ago, what are they going to write about? Well, you would think they're going to write about physical beauty and eroticism. They're going to write about abstract wisdom, in other words, more of a personification, not really of a woman, of an actual flesh and blood woman, but more like the personification of some national virtue, and that's not what it does. Or you're going to get the real flesh and blood version, but it's going to be the barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen thing, right? It's going to be that trope. It's none of those. None of those. It's incredible how it is. So what does it do? This poem praises the woman based on her activities and her achievements in the ordinary affairs of human life. It's about her being able to buy and sell, about her running a business. It's about her. It's about how she reflects on the honor and the praise of her husband. It's about all the ordinary things about life and how she is the linchpin of those things. So there's nothing there about it's not the Song of Solomon, right? There's nothing in there about her beauty. All it says about beauty in it is that beauty is vain. Incredible. There's no physical description of the woman. There's no focus on that. You would think it had been written today. It's incredible. This was written thousands of years ago. And it's the only thing we have in text of Scripture that speaks this way about men or women. So it's truly amazing as a poem. So who does it praise? Well, it praises a concrete and practical wisdom, not a theoretical wisdom, not like a national virtue type wisdom, but a concrete, practical wisdom. It centers that wisdom. It anchors that wisdom in an actual flesh and blood woman, and it roots all of it in the fear of God. That's the root of this woman's wisdom, which we'll talk about in a minute. And another thing it does is it praises her for being a take-charge entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a philosopher, and a profit-making venture capitalist. None of what you would expect to be said of a woman pretty much at any time in history. So it's very atypical. All right. Another thing that another writer, Erica Moore, she's a professor of divinity at Trinity, she wrote that the poem's use of military imagery and the cast into the domestic sphere presents the godly wife as the spiritual heir of Israel's of Israel's ancient legacy of heroes. Let me try to maybe simplify that. It may have gotten a little confused. So here's what she's saying. She's saying that what the poet has done in this is taken military terms and applied them to the domestic part of life. Raising a family, running a household, having a husband, right? Boring things. She's applied military imagery to the domestic life. And by doing so, the poet has deliberately linked women into the heroic legacy of Israel. Meaning that he is basically saying that women have as much claim on the storied heroism of the soldiers of Israel as the men do. That's what she's putting on there. Now, I would like to add to that our culture has not found a way to successfully do this. So why do I say that? Well, modern feminism is trying to do that, but they're trying to do it by turning women into men, right? That if a woman wants the glory of a soldier, then she actually needs to enlist. And the poet of Proverbs accomplished it by saying, no, a woman, by performing so admirably all of these type of activities, is as praiseworthy as a general coming back from a war won. That's what the poet is saying, right? So he's praising women in what they actually do, not telling them they have to become something else to be praiseworthy. So I find that very insightful. Now, overall, from what Erica Moore is saying and Bruce Waltke is saying, I think that the insight over all this is that the proper way to frame this poem and to frame what it's talking about is not the virtuous woman as it's many times called. The proper way to frame this is that it's the godly wife. Because the point of the text is that the woman is virtuous, this woman is virtuous because she is godly. Godliness is not another virtue. It is the reason why she is virtuous. All of her virtue, all of her strength, all of her achievement, all of it flows out of her godliness. Okay? And so that's how we're going to be considering this. Now, all right, getting to the point of the sermon today, this title of the sermon, which was responsibilities, we're going to be looking at this text because it not only tells us why she's virtuous, but by implication is telling all of you ladies what your responsibilities are, and that if you will fulfill them, if you will live up to these responsibilities, you too will be the virtuous woman. You too will be the godly wife. All right, so it lays out 6 of them, and there's just no way in the world I could ever get through all those in the little bit of time we have. So we're not even going to try. I'm going to tell you what the 6 are, and we're only going to look at the first 2. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what the 6 are. We're going to look at the first 2. So here are the 6 very briefly, and then we'll get on to looking at the first 2. So the first one is she has a responsibility. A woman has a responsibility to God, number 1. Number 2, she has a responsibility to her husband. Number 3, she has a responsibility to her children. Number 4, she has a responsibility to her community. Number 5, she has a responsibility to her business. And number 6, she has a responsibility to herself. And all of those things are dealt with in the text. I just encourage you to read them. I can send you some notes because I actually tried to develop most of these, and I just realized there was no way I could possibly get to them. So I could actually send you some notes if you want to look at them further. They are there. We need to, at some point in the future, talk about some of these, especially the ones that have been misconstrued by modern evangelicism. For instance, a woman's responsibility to her business. It is a very important topic. I don't want you to think that I'm in any way minimizing it, but this is not a woman's series. It is a marriage series. So I had to make some choices. And believe me, the hardest thing for me is to cut. Writing is easy, cutting is hard, right? So cutting out all those others hurt me more than it hurt you. All right. So we're only going to look at the first two. You ladies have a responsibility, number one, in your marriage, your number one marital responsibility. Number one. You men aren't going to like me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyways because I'm not talking to you. So the number one responsibility you have in marriage is to God. Number one. Very important to understand that. Like I said, all of her virtue flowed out of her godliness. Godliness was not the sum of all of her virtue. It was the source of all of her virtue. So you have a responsibility to God. Well, I'm just going to read you a couple of the verses from the text, verses 26 and verse 30. It says, she openeth her mouth with wisdom, and her tongue is the law of kindness. Favor, verse 30, favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. This is critically important responsibility. It's not just because it's spiritual to say, my number one priority is God. People say this all the time, and they don't often mean it. This is critical in marriage for both the man and the woman. And I don't mean it's critical for the man to fear God first. I mean it's critical for both the man and the woman, for the wife to put God first. Critical. Critically important. Because this responsibility, if you get this right, it resolves all other conflicts of interest, abuses of power, confusion of emotions, everything else that could cloud marriage, could cloud the other responsibilities where look, we're going to get to the second one, which all the men are just yanking at the bit for, right? The responsibility to her husband. They're like, let's just jump to that. You've said enough about God. Let's get to me. No, when we get to that one, you're going to see all kinds of conflicts are going to rise in your mind. Well, what about this? What about that? What if he says this? What if he acts this way? Lots of conflicts. What do I do? Who am I supposed? Putting God first resolves those things. Putting God first resolves those things. So it's very important, it's critically important that we put God first. So you have to remember, your first responsibility is to God. Now, this should not be hard for you. I have a little bit. I'm not a comedian, so it's not funny. So when I say that, don't think it's funny. But I do have a little bit that I talk about sometimes, about women and tools. And my point is this. To me, it's very odd that women don't love tools. And it's very odd to me that men do. Because for men, tools did not fundamentally make their life easier. Right? Tools make jobs go faster, but men don't work less hours. But tools fundamentally change women's lives. Red beans and rice in Louisiana is a dish that's developed so that women could put it to cooking in the morning and not worry about it while they wash laundry all day. Now, anyone can throw a load of laundry in. Theoretically, anyone could, right? Theoretically, your husband could. Now, you're all wondering, where is that husband who puts a load of laundry in, right? I know, I get it. But theoretically, anyone could do it, and you throw it in, and you forget about the laundry, and you worry about other things. So tools for you women have made your lives immeasurably better. They have freed you up immensely, your time, to pursue all other kinds of interests and activities and business ventures. You should love tools. Love them and love the people who make them. I make tools, by the way. I just wanted to put that in there. All right. I'm not saying anything, just telling you. I make tools. All right. So, in the same vein of that, you should also think that this responsibility of putting God first and putting Jesus first in your life, this should not be hard. I say it should not be hard because Jesus Christ is everything you've ever wanted. And I don't mean that, again, from a very spiritual way where you're supposed to say, well, yes, of course, and you don't really know why. I want to explain to you why that Jesus should mean so much more to you even than he does to men. And I wish I could explain it to you in my own words, but actually there's a English novelist who was also a Christian essayist by the name of Dorothy Sayers who wrote it. She gave a speech, and their speech was called Are Women Human? And she wrote it down, she published it. You can download, I encourage you to get it. You can download it and read it. It's a great little essay on women and the place of women in society and in culture. But here's what she says about how women should view Jesus Christ. So I'm going to read you. It's a little bit long, so I'm going to read it to you. She writes this. Perhaps it is no wonder that women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. There had never been such another. A prophet and a teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered or coaxed or patronized, who never made jokes about them, never treated them either as the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, who rebuked without querulousness and praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine or jeered at them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took them as he found them and was completely unembarrassed of them. There is no act, there is no sermon, no parable in all the Gospels that borrows its pungency from female perversity. Nobody could possibly guess from the words and deeds of Jesus that there was anything funny about a woman's nature. I encourage you to download that and read that carefully. But essentially what he's saying is, Jesus has always taken you seriously. Always. So putting Jesus first in your life should be very easy. Should be very easy. All right. Having said that, I would tell you this, that any godly husband will insist on a godly wife. So if you're wondering, those of you who are not married, if whoever it is you're considering for marriage is godly, the way you can know that is if they insist that you be godly first, that you put Jesus first and them second. Anyone who objects to that isn't godly, and they're not going to do you well. And that's because a godly man knows that his interests are best served when his wife first serves the Lord. It's like the widow that Elijah was sent to, right? And she had only this little cruse of oil, a little bit of meal, and he says, hey, make me dinner. And she says, I only have enough to feed me and my little boy. We're going to eat it, and then we're going to die. And he says, feed me first. And as long as she fed him first, her little boy had enough. Men need to understand that when a woman puts Jesus first in her life, it's the only way he'll have any, and certainly enough. Let me end this first point in this way, with this observation. For the world, religion is considered to be the pursuit of women. So if you look at non-saved religion, because you have to make a distinction between religion and people who are actually saved. But when you look at non-true Christian religion, What you have is a religion for women. It's dominated by women. In the church, an actual, real, true, Bible-believing Christianity, Christianity is the domain of men and is dominated by men. But for the wise, godliness is everybody. It's not the religion of the women, and it's not the domain of the men. Godliness is for everybody. And women need to realize that being spiritual and being godly and loving Jesus Christ and putting Him first in their life, that is their number one responsibility. And you cannot say, I'm just a woman, religion's for the men in the church. No. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. When I say that in the church, Christianity is the domain of men, that is not a praise, by the way, just to be clear. That is a corruption. Like Dorothy Sayers says, Jesus found women to be of equal value as men and treated them that way. Okay. Let's move on to the responsibility that you have to your husband, because you do. I want to be very clear on this. First responsibility is Jesus, but you have a responsibility to your husband. That's what marriage is. Now, you don't have to get married. And we're going to talk about that. We're actually going to have a whole week dealing with not getting married. It's a funny way to end a marriage series, right? But it's my way. That's how I like to end it. So we're going to talk about not getting married. However, if you are married, then you have a responsibility to your husband. And you cannot say, well, I'm a Christian and I'm just going to serve Jesus Christ and I'm married to God and therefore, I don't have that responsibility. I'm free from that chain. No. Paul says very clearly that when a woman marries, and you may be thinking right now, but what about men? Don't they? Don't think about that. I told you, we're not talking about men today. We're talking about women. When a woman marries, she forfeits her right to not have that responsibility. As long as you're not married, you have the freedom to not care what any man needs or wants. Absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the moment you get married, you forfeit that right. And it says that you must be concerned with your husband. He is your responsibility. Okay, let's read a few verses out of the text and let's look at them a little bit. It says, verse 11, the poem says, the heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. Verse 12, she will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. Verse 23, her husband is known in the gates when he sitteth among the elders of the land. Verse 28, her children will rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. So you see in this text that her connection to her husband, her responsibility to her husband looms large. It's a very important part of what her virtue is, of what her godliness takes her to be. And again, I want to reiterate something we said last week, and it applies here. Marriage is not something we do at the same time. It's something we do together, right? That's why there's a responsibility there. You're not just sharing dwelling quarters. You're not just roommates, right? This is a union of two people, and you have responsibilities, you ladies, in that union. When you join your life to some man's life, you have taken upon yourself voluntarily responsibilities that you must complete, that you must fulfill. All right. So upon marriage, a woman assumes a huge responsibility to her husband. I want to take a moment and contextualize that very carefully so you understand what I'm talking about. This goes far beyond cooking, cleaning, sexual satisfaction, or rearing children. Far beyond that. When I tell you you have an enormous responsibility to your husband, I'm talking about far beyond cooking meals. Far beyond that. Now, I will tell you this whole barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen trope, This is denigrating to women, but it's even more denigrating to men. Now, it may not seem that way. You may be thinking, how is that? Poor male chauvinist. No, it is. It is denigrating even more to men than to women. There's an old fable. Probably you've all heard it, but I'll tell it anyways. But there's this old fable of a scorpion that wants to cross the river, and he tells the frog, take me across the river. And the frog says, well, if I let you get on my back, you're going to sting me. And he says, why would I do that? If I sting you, we both drown. The frog thinks about it and goes, yeah, that's true. We'd both drown. So he gives him a ride across the river. And about halfway across the river, the scorpion stings him. And the frog turns around and with his dying breath says, why'd you do that? We're both going to die. He says, I know, but I'm a scorpion. When men reduce women to nothing more than cooks and maids and essentially unpaid prostitutes, they're not just destroying the woman, they're destroying the marriage and themselves. And themselves. It's violently self-destructive. They're like sailors who are firing their cannonballs through the hull of their own ship. That's the problem with men when they voice criticism and berate, would be a better way of putting it, berate their own wives. They're destroying themselves. So this goes far beyond just cooking and cleaning and things like that. All right, so what is it? What are we talking about? First, let me try to explain this. And see why we can see maybe from a little bit more current or modern perspective why this is so destructive to men and women. This whole mindset of like the barefoot pregnant in the kitchen mindset. It ignores the very deep impact that a woman choosing a man has on a woman. Now, if you do any research into evolutionary biology and especially evolutionary psychology, you're going to find that what I'm telling you is not just a Christian thing. These evolutionary scientists, even though I disagree with their conclusions on evolution, they acknowledge the same thing, and that is that a woman choosing a man is much more significant than a man choosing a woman. Because men aren't very choosy. They really aren't. That's just a fact. But women are, and there's reasons for that. There are biological, psychological reasons why women are much choosier than men. And men are very dependent on being chosen by a woman. Women are not so much by being chosen by a man. This is just a fact. Okay? Why is this? This is because God buried the key to men's emotional, psychological, moral, metaphysical, their power deep inside the competency of a woman. God made men and males incredibly powerful. And it's all buried and inaccessible to him for the most part. And the key to unlocking that is in a woman. And women, when they choose a man, if they're godly, they unlock tremendous potential in him. This is why men should be very careful with denigrating, berating the women in their life. Because you may think it's cliche to say behind every great man is a great woman, but that's actually true. It is actually true. It's cliche too, that's why I don't like it, but it's true. There's several ways you can see this. For instance, this is the underlying reality of the sexual dynamic in marriage. I'm going to be a little bit forward here, a little bit blunt. So, brace for impact. But let's look at this for a moment. Men are far more concerned, and I don't know if you know this, but men are far more concerned with satisfying their wife than they are themselves, sexually. Far more. Now, you may not think that's true, but it's true. This is why it's not uncommon for a woman to fake sexual satisfaction. Now, why would they do this? So perhaps you've watched When Harry Met Sally, right? And you know the scene I'm talking about, right? I'll have what she's having. Why would a woman fake sexual satisfaction? Well, it's because she knows it's very important to her husband to be able to satisfy her. Because it's very meaningful to him. Sex for men is not about their own pleasure nearly as much, hardly at all as much, as it is about being something to her, to the wife, fulfilling her, giving her something. And that's because that's how God designed men and women. He designed men to want to please women. Do you realize this is why men go to war? John Fowles, he's a novelist. He wrote this, a famous quote by him. He says, "Men love war because it allows them to look serious. Because they imagine it's the one thing that stops women from laughing at them." He's saying that all wars are about men trying to impress women. Pretty much everything men do is about trying to impress women. Pretty much everything. Because a woman's acceptance, a woman's acknowledgement, a woman's affirmation is key to a man's psychological well-being. You women hold tremendous power. There's another famous quote by God who says it's not good for a man to be alone. Right from, the first emotion that a man expressed in history is pining, loneliness, not being fulfilled, having all the earth at his feet, being the only exclusive emperor of all creation, meant nothing without a woman to impress her with it. It is a fact. So all of this that I'm talking about with men, this is not misogyny. Now there is a corrupt, infantile, pubescent version of it, right? But even that's not misogyny. It is inordinate love of women. But it's not misogyny, which is hatred of women. So a godly woman exercises this immense and unique power. How? By identifying a man who she chooses to have the best combination of compatibility and potential. And then she winds him up and sends him out. She unlocks it in him. When we look at the responsibility that the woman in Proverbs 31 is doing with her husband, she's not cooking him meals. I'm not saying she didn't. I'm saying that's not what it's talking about. It doesn't even talk about sexual satisfaction. When it talks about the relationship between that virtuous woman and the man, her husband, it is about how he has honor in the gates. How the best expression of it is the first one, verse 11. It says, the heart of her husband does safely trust in her, so he shall have no need of spoil. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't need any affirmation. He doesn't need any accomplishment because she is all of that for him. That's what she does. She affirms him. And I don't mean verbally. I don't mean, "You're the best, honey." No, I mean that her having chosen him, being so gloriously virtuous, and having picked him, that makes him. That's why it says that she will do him good and not evil all the days of his life. This isn't about washing his clothes, mopping his floor, and cleaning the noses of his children. That is debasing who you are as a woman far too much. I can hire someone to do that for me. But what you ladies bring to the marriage, you can't buy. If you do it. Right? If you do it. The problem is, if you have bought into the world's version of what women are, or the hyper-fundamentalist version of what women are, which are like two extremes of the same evil coin, then you're likely not being that virtuous woman in your marriage. All right. So having said that, let's get to a few conclusions. So women have a central role in marriage, and they are critical to the success of their husbands. Critical. This does not mean that you have to forfeit your own success. When we look at the virtuous woman, the success of her husband was not in lieu of her success, and it wasn't independent of her success, it was dependent. He was successful as a man because she was successful as a woman. He was successful as a man because she was a successful businesswoman, because she was a successful mother, because she was a successful entrepreneur, because she was a successful craftsman. All of her abilities were used in such a way that it unlocked his. You do not have to forfeit your career to be a good wife. You may think, if I only stayed at home, my husband would be happy. The problem is not geography. The problem is you have not found that key that you have that unlocks him. All right. So, in conclusion, this is what I want to get to. There is no place for the little woman mindset in Christianity. Now, if you ladies right now are thinking, that's right, you tell those men. I'm not speaking to men. I'm talking to you, ladies. Too many of you ladies have, I'm just a little woman mindset. And there's no place for that in Christian marriage. We do not need little women wives. And by we, I don't mean just men. I mean the church of God does not need little women wives. We need roaring, virtuous women wives. So what I'm about to say is not going to be like what I've already said. It's going to be a little offensive. So I'm going to try to say it as gently as I know how, which basically means it won't be gentle. Now, there's certainly a layer, or a degree of male guilt for this mindset. You can look at the way marriage and women and church and things like that are taught in many churches and say, well, they just push women down and step all over them, and the doctrine is anti-women, and it's the patriarchal, doctrine or whatever. And yet, you know what? You're right in some ways. Absolutely, I detest it. I despise it. I don't like teaching like that. People that teach are teaching that's done like that. I think women should be emboldened and empowered, and they should be. I think that the church is stronger when women are stronger, not weaker. Okay, but this is where the offense. This is the offensive part. Here it comes. So again, brace for impact. Here it comes. Even though there is a certain degree of male guilt in that, ultimately, it's because it's convenient for you women that you think this way. The reason you buy into that doctrine of patriarchal type doctrine is because it's convenient for you. You want to. You want to. You say, no. You do. I have tried for decades to break women out of this with almost no success because they're not that interested. In fact, they're the ones who most object to what I say on this matter. Most object. It's convenient for you to think of yourself as small, to not take advantage of the freedom and power that you hold because you say it's not your responsibility. He makes the decisions, and if he's wrong, it's his fault. God's not going to judge me. No. No, no, no. It does not work that way. No. God won't be mad at me. I just do what I'm told. I just follow him. You know, if he walks off a cliff, oh well. You just coast by. How many women in the church today are maximizing their gifts? I go to all these different churches that have open meetings, and I find tons of men at varying degrees of proficiency, teaching and preaching. Almost no women. Why is that? Why is that? You say, well, so many churches don't let women speak. This isn't one of those churches. We encourage you to. And when you do, or when women do, I don't want to make this personal, but when women do speak, how often is it they're just reading some psalm, some little verse, and they're all timid about it, and they have nothing of substance to say? What, God hasn't given you any gift? You don't know Jesus Christ? You don't have the Spirit? But it's so much easier, right? To be the little woman. All right. That's all I was going to say that's offensive. Everything else is, you got through that, it's all going to be easy going now. Easy going. So this text holds up a much loftier ideal of what a godly woman is and how she lives. Right? And so I want you to look at that text and think about it. And it's not, I don't want it to end with you saying, oh, it's just like, berating and you're, oh, you made me feel so bad. It's not what this text is supposed to do. It's not supposed to make you feel condemned. It's the ideal woman. It paints the ideal woman that you should aspire to. Now you may say, well, I could never be that woman. Well, that's how ideals work. You never should have an ideal that you can actually reach. And if you ever do reach your ideal, you need to redefine it as something far beyond your grasp, beyond your reach. Because if the ideal is not better than you, then you'll never improve. So yes, the text paints this very unattainable ideal of a woman. And you're thinking, I could never be that woman. That's why you can be that woman. Because it gives you something to reach for. It gives you something to attain. Paul spoke of himself that way. He had an ideal that he was reaching for. He says in Philippians, not as though I had already attained or already were perfect, but I follow after, if I may apprehend that for which I am apprehended of Christ Jesus. I don't count that I've already apprehended it, but one thing I do, I forget the things that are behind. I reach towards the things that are in front of me. I press toward the mark. Paul is saying, I have an ideal of what I should be, and I never think I've reached it, ever. I always am pressing towards it. This is your ideal right here. Proverbs 31. Don't look at it and feel depressed. Oh, I'm no good. I'm not that woman. Nobody's that woman. Which is why you can be that woman. You can be. You got to press towards it. You need to appreciate that what's happening is that God is redefining you. See, what we want to do in the face of an ideal is we want to redefine the ideal. and make it easier to reach. So I come out here and say, no, let me redefine all these virtues and make it where you can all say, oh, that is me. That doesn't help anybody. No, what you need to realize is not that you should redefine Proverbs 31. You should realize that what really is happening is God, through Proverbs 31, is redefining you to make you a much better version of yourself. All right, let me end with this. One commentator observes that when you read this poem, you're left with one very obvious thought. There's nothing left for the man to do. You ever notice that? You read everything she's doing, you're wondering, what is the husband doing? I don't know if you noticed, there's like this tweet. It's kind of like viral right now. You may have seen it. If you're on Twitter, you might have seen it. But there's this tweet a man put out, and he says that he took a picture of his wife, and she's down in the driveway shoveling snow, and he says, she just got done working a 12-hour shift overnight at the hospital, and she came home and shoveled the snow in the driveway. And all the men are saying, does she have any sisters? Like, what is a man doing? She's working 12 hours, shoveling the driveway. What's the man doing? When we look at this thing, we might think that, right? We might think, wow, if marriage is the reflection of the gospel, and here you have this woman who lacks nothing and leaves nothing for the man to do, well, how does that fit in? But I want you to think about it this way. When we look at the Bible, we find two different portraits of ourselves. One is the ideal portrait, which is Proverbs 31, us people, not just women, everybody. Proverbs 31, the ideal person that we don't need God to do anything for us. We're self-sufficient. We can cook, clean, run the business, run the household. We can do everything. And then there's another portrait, which we find in Ezekiel 16, which is the reality portrait, where God says, you know what happened? I came along and I found you like a waif, like a starving, orphaned little girl lying in her own filth in the street. And I took you up and I cleaned you and I clothed you and I set you with me. I married you. Those are the two portraits. Nobody gets to be Proverbs 31 without being Ezekiel 16. In the gospel, when we look at the bride of Christ, we see Proverbs 31. That's what we see, and we should see. Absolutely, without spot or wrinkle, gloriously clothed, serving Jesus out of love. But nobody got there by doing it. Jesus found us in Ezekiel 16, and he turns us into Proverbs 31. What is the husband doing in the gospel? He is turning his bride, the church, converting her, transforming her, morphing her from the waif of Ezekiel 16 into the glorious being of Proverbs 31. That's what he's doing. Now, I do want to point this out. He is not turning us into a trophy wife or a gold digger. That woman in Proverbs 31 is very busy. He wants to make you glorious and beautiful and powerful for a function, not just for appearance, right? But he's the one who's doing that. So what we find is that the virtue, the righteousness that we have in the gospel is not earned, it is received. It is given. It's grace, not works. Just as a sidebar comment, going back to marriage, you say, what's the man doing in Proverbs 31? The actual man, the husband. Well, he's doing all the same. So imagine the power of that marriage. If the woman is behaving that way and the husband is doing parallel achievements of his own, that is a powerhouse marriage right there. That's the marriage you should aspire to through the grace of Jesus Christ. And we will end there. Let us pray. Father in heaven, I thank you that when you saw us in Ezekiel 16, you saw through that to what you could turn us into in Proverbs 31. That you foresaw through your incredible wisdom what grace could accomplish in us, what grace could turn us into. And that you have turned us into, by your grace, by your power, these glorious, glorious beings. That now we have such power in the Spirit to serve you, to love you, to honor you, to achieve for you. And I ask that we would all take that in its fullest potential. I ask that we would all work for you, showing our love for you. And I ask these things in the name of Jesus, our true lover of our soul. Amen. I will see you all next week.